People really notice when their world begins to shrink. It doesn't happen all at once. A road becomes a driveway. A town becomes a house. A house becomes a single room. Years pass that way. Then, one morning, something unexpected appears, and suddenly the distance between where you've been and tomorrow seems much farther than you remember. Evelyn Mercer spent most of her time in the kitchen. The room sat at the back of the house where a wide window overlooked the yard. Years ago, the view had been one of her favorite things. In the spring, flower beds lined the fence. In the summer, rows of green stretched across the property in neat patches. Her husband had spent entire afternoons out there, moving from one project to the next without even seeming to finish any of them. Now the yard was mostly hidden beneath weeds. The fence still stood. So did the old shed near the rear corner of the property. Everything else had softened into a tangle of green. Evelyn rarely paid much attention to it anymore. Her mornings followed the same routine they had for years. She woke shortly after sunrise, made tea, listened to the radio while it cooled, washed the same cup she had used the day before. By afternoon, she would settle into a chair beside the kitchen window and watch whatever happened to be passing through the yard. Most days it was birds, occasionally a squirrel. The seasons changed more often than the view. At some point, the days had begun slipping together. Evelyn could no longer remember exactly when she stopped going into town. It hadn't happened all at once. One missed errand became two. A rainy afternoon became a reason to stay home, and then another. Eventually, staying home stopped feeling like a decision. The local grocery store delivered once a week. Every Thursday morning, a young man left a paper bag on her porch before moving on to the next house. Evelyn would wait until she saw his truck disappear down the road before opening the door to retrieve it. For a long time, that had been enough. This particular Thursday arrived much like any other. A light rain had fallen overnight, leaving the yard damp and shining beneath the morning sun. Evelyn waited until she saw the delivery truck disappear around the bend before making her way to the front door. The paper grocery bag sat where it always did. She bent to lift it, and the bottom gave away immediately. A carton of eggs rolled across the porch. An apple bounced once before dropping into the grass. Evelyn sighed and knelt carefully, gathering the scattered groceries one at a time. The apple had rolled farther than she expected. It came to rest near the corner of the porch where the weeds had grown thick against the foundation. As she reached for it, something caught her attention. A single green stem emerged from the weeds. Evelyn paused. The plant stood no more than 6 inches tall. A handful of narrow leaves stretched from its base. At the top sat a slightly closed bud no larger than the tip of her thumb. She couldn't remember seeing it before. The thing that struck her wasn't its appearance. It was where it had chosen to grow. The patch beside the porch received little sunlight. Most plants had struggled there. Even the weeds looked thin and pale. Yet this one appeared healthy. Evelyn picked up the apple and lingered a moment longer. The bud swayed gently in the morning breeze. For reasons she couldn't explain, she reached down and wrapped her fingers around the stem. The roots slipped from the damp soil with surprising ease. Carrying the groceries under one arm and the uprooted plant in the other hand, she stepped back inside. A drinking glass sat beside the kitchen sink. Without giving it much thought, she filled it halfway with her water and lowered the roots inside. Then she returned to her routine. By evening, the plant sat forgotten by the sink. The next morning, Evelyn noticed the glass while waiting for the kettle to boil. It sat near the kitchen sink where she had left it the day before. For a moment, she stared at it, trying to understand what looked different. Then she set the kettle down. It was the roots. They had grown. Evelyn stepped closer. When she had placed the plant in the water, the roots had been little more than pale threads hanging beneath a clump of dirt. Overnight, they had spread through half the glass. She lifted it carefully. The roots pressed against the sides like tangled white wire. The growth didn't seem possible. Then again, she knew very little about plants. Her husband would have known. For years, questions about flowers, shrubs, vegetables had been answered simply by asking him. Evelyn had never paid much attention to the details. She'd only enjoyed the results. Now she lowered the glass back onto the counter and watched the roots sway beneath the water. Perhaps some plants grew quickly. The explanation felt sufficient enough. She carried her tea to the window and settled into her chair. The plant remained on the counter for the rest of the morning. By afternoon, she found herself glancing toward it. Not constantly. Just enough to notice it was there. The following morning brought another surprise. The bud had opened. Evelyn discovered it moments after entering the kitchen. The flower itself wasn't especially large. Soft white petals surrounded a pale center no bigger than a coin. What caught her attention wasn't the bloom. It was the fact that she was certain it hadn't been there when she went to bed. She stood beside the counter for several moments. The petals looked almost delicate enough to tear beneath their own weight. By noon, she had moved the glass to the kitchen table. That spot received more sunlight. At least she assumed it had. Years earlier, she would have known exactly how much sunlight reached every room in the house. Back then, she and her husband spent entire weekends deciding where to place things. Now she simply chose the brightest spot she could find. The bloom remained open throughout the day. By evening, Evelyn caught herself looking forward to seeing it again the next morning. The realization was unusual enough to make her laugh quietly. It had been a long time since tomorrow mattered. The flower was gone when she woke up. Not the plant, only the bloom. The stem remained healthy. The leaves remained green, but the white petals had vanished completely. Evelyn searched the table, the floor, even the windowsill nearby. Nothing. No fallen petals. No wilted remains. No sign of the flower had existed at all. Only a new bud sat near the top of the stem, smaller than the first, tightly closed. The second bloom opened sometime during the night. Evelyn discovered it shortly after sunrise. This one was yellow, not pale yellow, but bright. The petals spread outward in uneven layers around a dark center that reminded her of sunflowers that had once grown beside the fence. She set her tea on the table and pulled out a chair. The bloom wasn't identical to a sunflower. It merely shared certain features, enough to stir a memory. Years ago, her husband had planted an entire row of them along the western edge of the property. By August, they had grown taller than either of them. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived, but the flower remained. Evelyn spent most of the morning seated nearby. Occasionally, she glanced toward the window. More often, she looked at the plant. By late afternoon, she realized she had left the radio off all day. The silence didn't bother her. The next morning, the yellow bloom was gone. Another bud waited in its place. By then, Evelyn had begun expecting it. The surprise no longer came from whether a flower would appear. The surprise came from what kind. That morning's bloom opened in shades of deep purple. The petals curled inward slightly. The shape reminded her of nothing she recognized. Evelyn carried the glass to the window for a better look. The roots now filled nearly the entire container. White strands twisted around one another beneath the water. Several pressed firmly against the sides. She tapped the glass gently with her fingernail. The roots trembled. The flower did not. For the first time, she considered calling someone. The garden center at the edge of the town still existed. Maybe somebody there could identify the plant. It was only a momentary thought. Making the call would invite questions. Eventually, someone would suggest bringing the plant in. That would require leaving the house. The idea exhausted her before it became a real possibility. So she kept the plant, and the plant kept blooming. Days passed. Every morning brought something new. Some flowers appeared familiar. Others looked entirely foreign. One bloom carried narrow blue petals that spread like tiny stars. Another produced clusters of small white blossoms that seemed too numerous for a stem that size. Each lasted a single day. Each disappeared during the night. Each left behind a new bud. Soon, Evelyn's mornings developed a purpose. She woke, made tea, checked the plant. Only then did she begin the rest of her day. The change was small, yet impossible to ignore. One afternoon, she caught herself watching the clock. The realization made her laugh. She wasn't waiting for supper or expecting a visitor. She was waiting for morning, waiting to see what the plant would do next. Outside, summer continued quietly beyond the window. The weeds grew taller. The shed disappeared deeper beneath the green growth. A section of the fence finally collapsed after a storm rolled through one evening. For years, changes like that had barely registered. This time she noticed, and she wasn't entirely sure why. The blooms continued. Evelyn stopped trying to count them after the second week. Some resembled flowers she vaguely recognized from gardens she had known years ago. Others appeared entirely unfamiliar. One morning she found a bloom no larger than a button. The next day produced one nearly the size of her hand. No pattern ever emerged. The unpredictability became part of the appeal. Each morning carried the possibility of a surprise. Before long, the plant occupied a permanent place at the center of the kitchen table. The arrangement forced Evelyn to move several things. A stack of old magazines disappeared into a cabinet. A decorative bowl she hadn't used in years found a home elsewhere. The table slowly became the plant's. She didn't notice herself making room for it. The changes just happened. One morning, while waiting for the kettle to boil, Evelyn found herself standing at the sink. The yard stretched beyond the window. Tall grass swayed in the breeze. The collapsed section of fence remained where it had fallen from the storm. Near the shed, weeds had grown high enough to conceal most of the lower wall. For reasons she couldn't explain, that sight bothered her. The feeling remained with her throughout the day. By evening, she had carried a small notebook from the kitchen drawer and placed it beside the plant. The next morning, she wrote a description of the bloom. The morning after that, she added another. Soon, several pages contained rough notes. White petals, blue star-shaped bloom, yellow flower resembling a sunflower, purple curled petals. The notebook served no real purpose, but she kept it anyway. One afternoon, she caught herself wondering what her husband would have thought of the plant. Unlike previous memories, the thought didn't bring that familiar heaviness. Instead, she found herself imagining the questions he would have asked. How much water? How much sunlight? What type of soil? The practical details he always seemed to understand. The memory stayed with her for the rest of the day. That evening, she moved the plant closer to the window. The following morning, Evelyn woke to find no bloom appeared. She paused beside the table. The stem looked healthy. The leaves remained green. The roots still filled the glass. Yet the bud was gone. For the first time since bringing the plant inside, nothing had replaced it. She checked again after breakfast, after lunch, and again before bed, but nothing had changed. The next morning offered no bloom either. Evelyn sat quietly at the table. The absence felt strange. Not disappointing, worrying. She examined the roots through the glass. There was almost no room left. White strands pressed against one another from top to bottom. The water level seemed to disappear faster now as well. By evening, she had refilled the glass twice. That night, she carried the plant to the sink and studied it beneath the kitchen light. The roots looked different now. They pressed against the sides of the glass from every direction. Several looped over themselves. Others had nowhere left to go. Evelyn turned the glass slowly in her hands. For the first time, she wondered how much longer the plant could remain there. She set it back on the table before going to bed. Evelyn woke early the next morning. For a few moments, she lay in bed. She dressed, made her way to the kitchen, and looked toward the table before the kettle even begun to heat. Nothing. No bloom. The plant sat exactly as it had the day before. Green leaves, crowded roots. Evelyn stood quietly beside the table. Eventually, she turned away and continued with the rest of her morning. The following day brought the same result, and the day after that. No bloom appeared, no new bud emerged. The plant seemed frozen in place, healthy yet unchanged. The notebook remained beside it. For the first time since she began keeping it, no new entry was added. Several times she opened the cover, several times she closed it again. There was nothing to write. That afternoon, she carried the plant to a different window. The next day, she moved it again. A day later, she changed the water entirely. When none of that worked, she reached through the kitchen drawers until she found an old glass vase large enough to hold the roots. The transfer took most of the morning. Water spilled across the counter. The roots tangled around one another as she worked. By the time she finished, the plant occupied nearly the entire vase. Evelyn stepped back, certain she had solved the problem. But the next morning offered nothing. She found herself disappointed by how much that bothered her. The blooms had never changed her life. They didn't repair the fence, and they didn't clear her yard, yet the kitchen felt strangely empty without them. Days passed, the vase remained on the table. The plant remained unchanged. One evening, while searching a closet for an old blanket, Evelyn discovered a gardening book tucked behind several boxes. The cover was faded. A layer of dust coated the spine. She carried it to the kitchen. Hours passed beneath the soft glow of the lamp. Most of the information meant little to her. Latin names, soil types, seasonal schedules. Pages of details she had ignored for most of her life. Still, she continued reading. Near midnight, she closed the book and stared at the plant. Her eyes drifted toward the roots. Even inside the vase they looked crowded, pressed together, twisting over one another, searching for space. The realization arrived slowly, so slowly that she almost missed it. The plant had never belonged in the glass, or the pitcher, or her house. It had simply tolerated them. Evelyn looked toward the dark window. Beyond it, the yard waited beneath the night. The fence, the weeds, the patch of ground she had spent years avoiding. For a long time she remained seated. Then she glanced back toward the plant. Toward the roots pressing against the sides of the vase. Toward the leaves that remained healthy despite everything. A thought settled quickly into place. Not tomorrow, not next week. Soon. The plant needed to be in the ground. For the first time in years, Evelyn found herself wondering what waited outside the front door. The next morning, Evelyn opened the front door. Not all the way, just enough to let the morning air inside. She stood there for several moments. The yard looked larger than she remembered. The grass reached nearly her knees in some places. Weeds crowded the old flower beds. The section of fence damaged by the storm still leaned inward at an awkward angle. Everything bore the marks of time and neglect. Evelyn rested one hand against the doorframe. The sight should have overwhelmed her. Instead, it made her tired. Not physically, the kind of tired that comes from postponing something for too long. She closed the door, returned to the kitchen, and spent the rest of the day thinking about the yard. The next morning, she opened her door again. This time, she stepped onto her porch. The boards creaked beneath her weight. A breeze stirred the grass. Somewhere nearby, a bird called from the trees. Evelyn remained there for less than a minute before retreating inside. The following day, she remained outside for 3 minutes. The day after, she walked to the edge of her porch, and by the end of the week, she stood in the yard itself. Not far from the house, but farther than she had been in years. The progress felt almost ridiculous, yet she continued, one small step at a time. Eventually, she carried the vase to the door before removing the heavy plant. The weight surprised her. The roots had consumed nearly every inch of available space. White strands pressed against the glass from every direction. Evelyn chose a patch of ground near the side of the house. The area received plenty of sunlight, or at least it had years ago. Now weeds covered most of it. She spent the afternoon clearing a space no larger than her table. The work left her sore. That evening, she slept more soundly than she had in months. The following day, the plant went in the ground. When she finished, she stood quietly above the patch of soil. The plant looked smaller in the ground, almost ordinary. Evelyn remained there for a while before returning inside. The next morning, she went out and checked for a bloom. There wasn't one. The morning after that brought the same result. A week passed, and then another. Still nothing. The blooms never returned. Not the white one, not the yellow one, not the one with the blue stars. None of them. At first, the absence disappointed her. Then gradually she stopped expecting them. The plant remained healthy. Its leaves grew broader. Its roots disappeared into the soil below. The strange cycle of daily blooms became nothing more than a memory. As summer drifted toward autumn, the patch around the flower expanded too. One section of weeds became 2, and then 3. The collapsed fence was repaired. The shed emerged from beneath years of overgrowth. Slowly, almost without noticing, Evelyn found herself spending more time outside than in. The work never truly ended. There was always another branch to trim, another section to clear, another project waiting somewhere in the yard. She didn't mind. One Thursday morning, the grocery truck arrived as it always had. The young driver carried a paper bag up the walkway and paused. For a moment, he looked toward the kitchen window, then toward the house. The curtains were open. The chair beside the table sat empty. After setting the groceries on the porch, he glanced across the yard. An elderly woman stood near the fence line. One hand rested on the handle of a shovel. The other shaded her eyes from the afternoon sun. The driver lifted a hand in greeting. Evelyn returned the wave. Then she looked back toward the work waiting for her. Years later, she would sometimes think about the flowers, the different blooms. She never found another plant quite like it, and she never saw a single bloom after moving it into the ground. The plant remained healthy, green, ordinary, exactly where she had planted it. By then, that seemed to be enough.